certainly I think when performers become industrialized themselves, right, when they start being recorded and performances are spread over the screen, writers' stock falls pretty precipitously. The joke, so stupid they had sex with the writer, it really emerges from that moment as the writer's star falls and the performer's star rises.
Yes, it does. It has to be the recorded moment, because prior to that, only a minority of actors, without recorded performance, can become big names.
Yeah, without industrial distribution schemes, the fame of a creator is limited to the number of people who can physically be co-present with them, or view a manually produced instance of their work.
In fact, in everyday populist forms today, generally speaking, writers are of far lower stock than performers. It's a standard thing in soap operas and so on that the actors claim to write their own lines, and the powerless hack writers can't do anything about it.
I think also when it comes to burlesque, much of burlesque has actually been benefited by the fact that you could get your hands on things, because it's often a reaction to something that's been written before. So it's many times a burlesque will be a parody of something. That's kind of what it means. So somebody will say, take a play that's been done by somebody else, add sexy times to it, and then put it on stage to titillate the audience. That's how you make a burlesque more interesting to your audience. So there have been burlesque. The first burlesque in the United States was called Ixion, which is a Greek play. And the reason why they put it on was because it was an all-female production, which is why it was a burlesque, because they were flipping it and creating this sexualized version. So I think in many ways the industrialization actually helped burlesque become an art form because we had more access to things. What I think is kind of interesting is that we're talking about, in England, the Lord Chamberlain existed in police theater, which we didn't have in the United States. So the burlesque movement in the United States was being policed not by a theatrical board, but by the police, and by specifically what we call community standards. Community standards comes up a lot in the legal definitions of obscenity, but what it typically comes from is somebody objecting to something they saw in the theater, and so they scurry off and tell somebody else, and it gets back to somebody in power, whether it's Fiorello LaGuardia, who was the mayor of New York, who decided to crack down on the burlesque theaters of New York City, or if it's a police commissioner who's decided that they don't want this in their town anymore. And you see it over and over again up until now. There was recently a crackdown on burlesque in Jersey City because they were posting photos of their shows on Facebook. And so the local community, not the local community of actual people who live in Jersey City, but the people in local government said, we don't want this in our zoning laws, so we're going to change the way that you're allowed to do theater in this neighborhood.
So in the 40s and 50s, when everything breaks down and there's no ecclesiastical licensing, there are no bishops, there's no book licensing for a while, and it becomes a scandalous case that there are women preaching. And there's a particular pub actually called the Nag's Head, which is now, it would be on Coleman Street, which is up near Holborn somewhere. And in the Nag's Head, this well, I forget her name, but she runs a kind of discussion shop for how you would reform everything in the state and in the church and in society. And repeatedly, she's reported to the government from about 1641 right through the 50s. I can't remember when it stops. And so there is this sense that, I don't know, maybe these strolls are taking place in sites where, sure, people are drinking and carousing. There's something more to it than just being drunk and falling over, right? There's a
political culture to the pub scene in that sense.
Yeah, maybe.
And I think there is to burlesque as well. There is a very strong political movement within burlesque. I was talking to Ada yesterday about this, that there's this apocryphal moment when Gypsy Rose Lee was arrested in 1940, I think it's 1940, and as they're walking her out while she's being arrested, what she says to the press is, "But I was covered by a blue spotlight." And if this is apocrypha, which it might be, it still tells me something. What it tells me is that these women were completely aware of the fact that what they were doing was illegal, that what they were doing was subversive, and they were doing it anyway, because they wanted to make a statement about what their bodies could do and what they could do on a stage. And that's still happening in the burlesque movement now. It's still a part of the performance aspect. There are people who are performing in burlesque now who've never been allowed to do traditional theater. One of the performers I know is named Jacqueline Box, and she is a wheelchair user. And she says it's the first time in her life that she's been allowed to be beautiful and that she's been allowed to be objectified because she's a wheelchair user. And there's people who are doing nerdlesque, where Black women are doing acts like as Princess Leia, and they're able to embody a character who, for general purpose, they're not allowed to because of their race. So I think that there's an opportunity within the burlesque sort of art style to take on things and identify them and play with them in a way that you don't get to in other art forms. And I think it's interesting that, like, the example of the underboob debacle also occurs with, they all show up. This wasn't a prior explained issue. Everybody shows up from all over the world, and suddenly it's like, you need to make underboob covers before you can get on stage. So now you have frantic burlesque performers in Las Vegas trying to make new costume pieces. It's an extra barrier.
Yeah.
And I think that in some ways it's almost a deliberate, we don't approve of the thing that you're doing, so we're going to make it that much harder.